This is Sydney's King's Cross, famous for its sex and its drugs. Its landmarks include the El Alamein Fountain, once a hangout for the murdered prostitute Sallie-Anne Huckstepp. And the Empire Hotel, formerly the Carousel Club and Les Girls, the last known place where the publisher and activist Juanita Nielsen was seen alive. Exactly what happened to her and Sallie-Anne Huckstepp remains a mystery. But one thing is certain. They were the girls who knew too much.
A meeting arranged in a back street in the inner Sydney suburb of Chippendale last Saturday afternoon. Lanfranchi hit by 2 shots, one in the chest, one in the head, fired by Detective Sergeant Roger Rogerson. Rogerson in the beige jumper, along with a detective mate, is shown shortly after the incident that ended the career of a 23-year-old outlaw.
It's Saturday, June 27th, 1981, and the headline news is the afternoon shooting of heroin dealer Warren Lanfranchi by Detective Roger Rogerson. It's still many years before the true nature of Rogerson's corrupt activities are known to the public, and the media reports the death as a victory of good over evil.
Lanfranchi had just come out of jail, and there were stories about him bashing people with a baseball bat, and it would have been easily, I mean, most journalists would have written it up as a hero policeman.
This is a strange story. At the moment, it looked like a hardened criminal who's involved in some sort of drug deal, and who the report that night on the news was that he'd taken a gun and aimed the gun at Rogerson, and in self-defence he'd been shot.
Warren Lanfranchi has recently been released from jail after serving all but 4 months of a 5-year sentence for stealing colour TV sets. It's during this time that he becomes acquainted with the notorious career criminal Neddy Smith.
He looked up to Neddy. He thought Neddy was the kind of man he'd like to be. They both were really good boxers. I mean, Lanfranchi apparently used to box at Newtown Police Boys Club, and Neddy used to fancy himself, so I think he looked up to him as physically too, and he was smaller than Neddy, because Neddy's a giant. Then he just saw the money that they were making, you know.
But Warren Lanfranchi's lover, the former prostitute and heroin addict Sallie-Anne Huckstepp, believes her boyfriend is a victim of foul play and goes about setting the record straight in an interview with Ray Martin on 60 Minutes.
This is real. This is not something that I have made up in revenge or...
She talked lovingly about him, accepted that he was a bit of a brute and a thug, but nevertheless was in love with him. So I spent probably 3 or 4, maybe 4 or 5 hours with her that night when we did the interview. And when I left with the Channel 9 QC, he said he thought that she was telling the truth, as I thought she was telling the truth.
He said he didn't know what time he'd be home, but if he wasn't home by 6 o'clock, then I'd know he'd been killed.
Sallie-Anne explains that Lanfranchi had unwittingly ripped off drug dealers working for corrupt police, and with the help of Neddy Smith, arranges a payoff that involves giving $10,000 to Roger Rogerson immediately and another $20,000 at a later time. And it's in a back lane in the inner city suburb of Chippendale where Roger organises to meet Warren Lanfranchi.
He got shot by Rogerson twice up a laneway with a dozen or so cops nearby. They could have taken him easily, but they didn't. They wanted to get rid of him. And this is where it all starts, really, for Sally, because I think a lot of people have said that she's a whistleblower and she's a saint, but I don't think she was. I think really that after that she decided to get Rogerson and get Smith and pay them back. And everything that she did after that was out of loyalty and revenge.
Shortly after her appearance on 60 Minutes, it's reported in the National Times newspaper that a very large sum of money is being offered in the underworld to have Huckstepp killed.
It wasn't just the Lanfranchi shooting, that was the trigger for her, because she then gave evidence to the Internal Affairs about all the police officers she'd paid over the past 5-10 years in the drug squad and the armed hold, not in various different squads. So once she went public, her life changed.
Sallie-Anne fears for her safety, but on the flip side, she revels in the ensuing notoriety.
She loved that period when she was sort of working for Penthouse and selling her autobiography and hanging around with artists and musicians and rock stars. That was great for her, but it only lasted a short time.
She was also a very beautiful woman. You could see, even in that sort of destroyed state that she was in because of the drugs and the prostitution.
She is born Sallie-Anne Crivishau on December 12, 1954, and raised, together with her younger sister Deborah, by their father Jack in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Sallie-Anne's an intelligent girl, but in her early teens, she gains a reputation for being rebellious and appears in the Metropolitan Children's Court to face a charge of smoking Indian hemp, and is released on 12 months probation. At her father's request, Sallie-Anne spends time at Minda, the children's home. Sallie-Anne meets Brian Huckstepp, an art student, who introduces her to heroin and prostitution.
Well, she had a number of partners, and Brian Huckstepp was someone she fell in love with, and they had a child. It was the only child she had, Sasha, and he was also a heroin addict. And so two heroin addicts with a young child. They had to get money somehow, and she was probably the best person to earn the money.
Sallie-Anne's marriage to Brian falters, but the two remain amicable. In her own way, she's a good mother, and her daughter is the most important thing in her life. But as her celebrity fades, Sallie-Anne returns to the world she knows best and commences a relationship with the heroin dealer David Kelleher.
He was in the Lanfranchi mould, you know, tough guy. But he was higher up the ladder than Lanfranchi. You know, he was a major player in the drug scene. He was from the same sort of background as Sally, in the middle-class background. And she called him her blonde god. And they had a long relationship, and then he went to jail for a long period. And she was left dealing in Sydney with no money, and that's when she got involved with the Federal Police to try and get Kelleher out of jail.
Sallie-Anne attempts to get a copy of the brief of Kelleher's upcoming trial through the Federal Police, and in return, she assists them in their search for stolen furs. But things are further complicated when Sallie-Anne starts an affair with Peter Smith, one of the AFP officers in question.
All these, the heavy hitters are all sitting back saying, look, this Sally, we know she's back on the drugs. She's untrustworthy. That's her form from way back. She's had association with all these criminals. They all knew her. And now they say, look, she's hanging around with this Peter Smith, and the word is that she's in love with him. She could be telling him anything, you know, so I don't think that done her any favours.
Meanwhile, Sallie-Anne owes money to Warren Richards, her drug supplier, and in turn is dealing heroin to pay the debt. She is also secretly recording her conversations with both state and federal police.
She rang me and said, look, there's much more I can tell you, much more I want to talk about, but I fear for my life.
Sallie-Anne senses that her time is running out, and in 1985 celebrates what will be her last Christmas with her daughter. At 31 years of age, Sallie-Anne Huckstepp is living a dangerous life.
What's the you hang out with the copper, Sally?
Nothing.
Hey?
Just a friend, all right?
Hey, he's not very smart.
Right.
You better watch it. What do you want?
Just two.
Got money?
She is increasingly afraid of her drug dealer, Warren Richards, now the only person willing to supply her with heroin.
You better start thinking, Sally. You don't know where you're going to die.
Richards is a judo and karate champion who represented Australia in the 1976 Olympics and is linked to Nettie Smith and the soon-to-be disgraced detective Roger Rogerson.
In the 1980s, some of the corruption was more widespread than it had been in even earlier notorious times, and that is because the drug trade had become so pronounced in the 1980s, and she herself was very much part of that drug scene emanating from, you know, the night spot areas of New South Wales.
On the night of February 7th, 1986, just prior to 11 o'clock, Sallie-Anne Huckstepp is at home in Edgecliff with her flatmate, Gwen Beecroft, when the phone rings.
A male's voice asked for Sallie-Anne. Sally was in the shower, she got out, and Beecroft said, "Who was that?" She said, "It's Wazza. At least I don't have to go to Ashfield this time." Ashfield was a place where she used to buy drugs. She became really flustered. She ran round looking for her keys, couldn't find them, and then she went downstairs and got into a car and drove to Centennial Park. So he left the house about 11 o'clock. It's a 5-10 minute drive to Centennial Park, particularly at that time of night.
Huckstepp parks on Martin Road, adjacent to Centennial Park, and enters the dimly lit grounds. She never returns. The following morning, a jogger reports to the ranger that he saw a body floating in Busby's Pond.
Despite a search, there were no clues for the police, but detectives are suspicious.
Reasonably obvious that she had been put into the lake, would appear to have been drowned, but without anything from the proper post-mortem, it was only speculation that that's what had happened.
And I pulled the sheet back and I saw who it was, and I turned to Jeff and I said, "You know, we're in a lot of trouble here." I said, "Do you know who this person is?" And he said, "No." I said, "That's Sallie-Anne Huckstepp." I said, "We're going to be stuck with this the rest of our life."
The initial post-mortem proves inconclusive, and so a second examination is conducted, and the evidence now points to an attempt at manual strangulation. Almost 2 weeks after the murder, the official cause of death is given as drowning due to asphyxia.
The basic line of investigation was trying to retrace her steps that night. There was search done of the area, of the crime scene. There's all sorts of red herrings popped out of that, of course. We have the one where the police badges found it, and that got some media attention. Of course, that badge was a collar number off an inner city cyclist who happened to respond to the call and was then given part of the job of searching the grounds, and his number had fallen off in the grass. So that was one thing that happened. Then we were trying to find it. We went back to the cause of her leaving the flat, the telephone call, and interviewing those people there. But some of this evidence had been polluted by the fact that other police had been there looking and doing certain things unknown to us, uncoordinated by the main body of investigation.
As a result, progress in the case is slow, fragmented, and vital information isn't passed on to the appropriate homicide detectives.
There was a list of suspects, not necessarily in the right order, but David Kelleher, even though he used to like Sallie-Anne Huckstepp. I don't think he trusted her. I don't think he trusts anyone. And if he got wind that they were trying to set him up, or she was being involved in it, that might be a reason, I would think. You got Nettie Smith and Roger Rogerson. Roger had moved into a different circumstance from being a police officer to associate of criminals. The evidence is that she didn't like Nettie Smith, although she used to tolerate him, I think, and he's alleged that he's supposed to have raped her or something one stage. But they were associated through drugs, and then you got Warren Richards.
He certainly made the phone call, and that was the reason she went out at that time of night. The two main suspects, Smith and Rogerson, don't really have a strong alibi. Rogerson doesn't have an alibi. He says he was at the Maryland's bowling club with some other people. That's not an alibi. It's just something he says. There's no proof of that. He didn't sign in.
Nettie Smith claims that he was at home in Newcastle with his wife, celebrating their wedding anniversary on the night of Sallie-Anne's death.
As any good barrister will certainly point out to you, there's a bit of difference between information and evidence. Everyone wanted to give us information. Everyone had an idea, has a theory, but it was very hard to transfer that into evidence. There's no one prepared to go to court and swear it, and indeed that was exemplified in the days that we went to the coroner's court.
The inquest into Sallie-Anne Huckstepp's death begins in the Glebe Coroner's Court on January 20th, 1987. Over the next 4 years, there will be just 19 sitting days. Warren Richards again refuses to answer questions on the grounds it might incriminate him. And David Kelleher says nothing.
He was reminded by the coroner that under the coroner's act, he was compelled to answer certain questions, and he replied, "I'm doing 25 years, what are you going to do? Send me back to my cell, goodbye." And he got very emotional about it, very emotional.
Roger Rogerson claims that he would rather not have her around, but that he would not resort to killing her. Nettie Smith isn't called, despite the fact that he was seen in the company of Warren Richards in the Covent Garden Hotel a little more than a month after Sallie-Anne's murder. The inquest finishes as it started, with insufficient evidence to charge anyone with Sallie-Anne Huckstepp's murder, and a major break in the case is still a number of years away. By the middle of the 1990s, the investigation into Sallie-Anne Huckstepp's murder is cold. But one of the main suspects, Nettie Smith, who by now is suffering Parkinson's disease, is in jail for his part in the murder of a tow truck driver.
A prisoner who we can't say whose name it is was placed in the cell with Nettie Smith in Long Bay. He used to tape music off the radio, and one stage he taped Nettie Smith talking about the murders he'd committed. And he played it to himself the next morning and thought, I might be able to use this. So he contacted the prison authorities, and they contacted police, and they installed a tape recorder in his computer. And he started taping Nettie Smith every night.
He says that he killed Sallie-Anne because Roger Rogerson told him she was taping police who were supplying heroin to the drug trade.
Hi.
How you going?
Thanks for coming.
That's all right. What do you want?
Just sorry.
According to the tapes, Smith is lying in the grass inside the gates of Centennial Park when she arrives to meet Warren Richards.
Thanks.
No problem.
Neddy grabs her by the throat and snaps Sallie-Anne's jugular. She fights back, scratching Smith down both sides of his face. Neddy strangles Sallie-Anne for 6 minutes, lifting her off the ground in the process. She loses consciousness, but is still alive. Smith applies a ligature made out of a piece of cord and 2 wooden broom handles. But when that fails, he decides to drown her.
Warren, get over here. Get over here. Grab her legs. Grab her legs now. Quick. Quick. Chuck her in the lake.
He claims that with the help of Warren Richards, Sallie-Anne is dragged into Busby's pond. Neddy then stands on her back in the shallow water for a further 5 minutes. Sallie-Anne Huckstepp is dead.
The bitch won't be talking anymore now.
But Smith's story contains a peculiar detail. He says that he leaves a federal police badge that Roger Rogerson had given him next to the body.
That's not true. But a lot of the details that he described about how he was hiding in the grass, when Richards brought her in, he jumped up, grabbed her by the throat, started punching her and strangling her, and then trod on her in the pond, kept her under. He's a big man, she's a small woman, and he kept saying on the tapes how hard it is to strangle someone with your bare hands.
But the addition of the federal police badge is a perplexing revelation, given that no such badge was ever found near Busby's pond.
Whether it was to implicate Roger, I don't know, but historically you can say just about every confession we've ever had from criminals in murder scenes, there's always something they never tell you. For some reason, you can get complete confessions of everything, but you always find some little detail that doesn't match up.
In a subsequent statement, Neddy Smith says that the taped confession of 6 murders, including that of Sallie-Anne Huckstepp, is a fabrication. He insists that he knew his cellmate was an informant and that he knew he was being recorded.
What's most convincing about the story, I think, in the tapes is that there's a real relish with which he tells the story of how he killed her. He hated her. And he really enjoyed it. With the other ones, it was all a bit of fun. But with this one, he really enjoyed it. And he says on the tapes, it was the best thing I ever done in my life.
Meanwhile, Huckstepp's body is exhumed and re-examined. An X-ray shows a fractured hyoid which had not shown up on the original radiographs in 1986. Given the details of Neddy's confession, this is a significant finding. Sallie-Anne's fingernail clippings are sent to England for DNA analysis.
There's a telling piece, because he says in the tapes how she scratched him and got him on both sides of the face, and then to cover it up he got his Michelle Richards to do the same thing to him in the pub.
Michelle Richards is Neddy Smith's former girlfriend and Warren Richards' wife. Smith is now charged with Sallie-Anne Huckstepp's murder. At the committal hearing, the case against Neddy Smith is compelling. A witness, codenamed Mr. Green, claims that in February 1986, Smith called him and said, quote, "I'm going to get rid of Sally. I want you to bury her for me." It's established through DNA testing that the cellular material under Sallie-Anne's fingernails could have come from Neddy Smith. And the taped confession is chilling.
After the committal, it looked very obvious that Smith had done it. You know, there was overwhelming evidence pointing towards him being the murderer.
Magistrate Pat O'Shane orders Neddy Smith to stand trial in the Supreme Court for Sallie-Anne Huckstepp's murder. But the Crown's case falters. The prosecution is hindered by changed testimony, inconsistencies, and most importantly, the absence of vital witnesses, such as Bill Duff.
Bill Duff ran a hotel called the Iron Duke Hotel. He maintains that Nettie Smith came in there with scratches down his face the morning after the murder. He wasn't called to give evidence, and his evidence would be the most incriminating, and he wasn't called because apparently he wasn't called because they have a policy of not using witnesses who've been in jail.
He's innocent but not free.
A jury of 8 men and 4 women find Nettie Smith not guilty of killing Sallie-Anne Huckstepp, but he's later given a life sentence for another murder confession from the same tapes.
When people seek to profile these days major crime figures, one of the first things often you'll find is they've been charged with murders but acquitted. They have the money to pay for the best barristers to find any discrepancy or mistake in police investigations.
Get over here.
I don't think Smith would act on his own in a case like this, which would bring so much media attention to him and Rogerson particularly. And the way he says on the tapes, well, it's got to be done. It's like he's acting under orders.
Sallie-Anne Huckstepp paid the ultimate price, but as coroner Greg Glass outlined in his findings at the inquest in 1991, she had inhabited the shadowy world of heroin addiction and had numerous criminal convictions. He added that no one is saying that Huckstepp's death is Huckstepp's fault, but she can't have been unaware of the enormous risks she was taking.
She seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of what was going on. And so that made her, from a television point of view, made her a great witness. And I would have thought from a police point of view as well. But I guess, we didn't realise that there were so many factions, and we didn't realise there was so much skullduggery going on with the police force.
She's been called the most important whistleblower in New South Wales police history. I always think whistleblower is too elevated a term, but I see her more as just someone who's gutsy and and loyal, and she stood up for what she thought was right.
Between 1994 and 1997, a decade after her death, the Wood Royal Commission exposed the level of police corruption that Sallie-Anne Huckstepp had known all too well and, in her own small way, had helped to eradicate. In the early 1970s, Victoria Street is a stunning boulevard running from King's Cross to Potts Point, lined with leafy plane trees and flanked by 19th century terrace houses. The western escarpment overlooks the Domain, the Botanic Gardens and magnificent Sydney Harbour.
Oh, Victoria Street's a very interesting street. It is a very cosmopolitan street. At that time, it was a real mix of expensive accommodation and working class accommodation. There's a lot of the old stunning Victorian houses were in that era were broken up into flats and were low cost accommodation.
Frank Tiemann is a successful and wealthy Jewish migrant who's made his fortune from lingerie. He wants to change Victoria Street forever. Between March 1970 and June 71, he spends nearly $7 million purchasing properties. Tiemann doesn't anticipate any opposition and in fact believes that the demolition of old terraces for chic new buildings, some as high as 45 stories, is not only a good idea, but will be hugely profitable.
With charming restaurants and green areas.
Frank had this vision of creating Victoria Street as Sydney's equivalent of Sutton Place in New York. a fabulous local environment which he believed that he could bring to Sydney.
In April 1973, Deepens company sends out eviction notices to around 400 Victoria Street residents, ordering they vacate their homes immediately. About 1/4 of them comply, while others who have protected tenancies are given cash incentives of up to $2,000 to leave.
Because it was reasonably high profile, that in the fair bit of media reports of it, I thought it'd be pretty silly of them to come at anything really heavy. I was mistaken in that.
Defiant locals form the Victoria Street Residents Action Group and are determined to halt the evictions and oppose the redevelopment.
I was one of a number of people who felt pretty strongly about it. As I say, I'd lived in the street for quite a few years. So I became the face of the... I guess I was the resident who was most involved in the formation of the action group.
At his home in the early hours of April 14, 1973, Arthur King is woken by intruders and kidnapped. After nearly 3 days, King is released under the condition that he leaves his home in Victoria Street and has no further involvement with the Residents' Action Group. He agrees to the demands.
It was really a political battle as well, in one sense, because you had Frank, the capitalist, up against the residents, the working class, so to speak, who stood on the other side of this ideological fence.
We were aware of the fires that were started to get residents out. We were aware of the squatters down the other end of the street where Victoria Point development is now. We were aware of the thugs that were threatening and bullying people to get tenants out at that time.
Significantly, the Residents' Action Group has an ally. The New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation, under Jack Mundy, imposes a ban on the demolition of Victoria Street.
It was a change of focus for the BLF. They weren't just fighting union issues, they were now fighting a social issue. And the BLF were approached and they put a green ban on Victoria Street.
And I warn now that any employer who attempts to demolish any building in the area upon which we've imposed a ban will be driven out of the industry for keeps. He won't work in the building industry again.
Juanita Nielsen, the occupant in 202 Victoria Street, is also strongly opposed to the redevelopment. A committed social activist, Nielsen, however, is not aligned to the Residents' Action Group.
With those people removed from the street, she saw herself as the only person there left to fight the battle for Victoria Street. And she did so through her paper, through Now. And the paper became her soapbox. She became somebody who was converted to campaigning journalism.
In 1973, Juanita is offered $200,000 for her tiny terrace in Victoria Street, an extraordinary amount of money at the time, but she resists the pressure to sell. Born Juanita Jones Smith on April 22nd, 1937, she's the only child of Neil and Wilma.
Juanita was a very elegant person. She came from a patrician background, a family of old money, one of the wealthiest families in Sydney, the Foy family. They owned vast tracts of land in the eastern suburbs.
When she spoke to you, what I particularly liked about her was that she really focused her eyes on you. She had these very dark brown eyes and she'd focus on you, and because she was giving you she was paying full attention to what you were saying.
For Juanita, The 1968 takeover and sale of the Mark Foy's department store is a precursor to the Victoria Street standoff many years later. She wants it to continue to operate as a family business and is concerned about what might become of their employees if it's sold.
Now, she said, we've got these old-timers who have been extremely loyal to us as a family and to the shareholders of the business. Will be out straight away and they'll be replaced with, and her exact quote was, pretty little things in black miniskirts. And she said, I have no intention of just standing by and see that happen.
Ironically, it's through a gift of $50,000 from her father following the eventual sale of Foy's that allows Juanita to purchase 202 Victoria Street. She also buys the local newspaper Now and forms a partnership with press photographer David Farrell on a personal and professional level. Together, they consolidate Now from a local rag, predominantly interested in advertising and entertainment, to a far more serious political and crusading newspaper.
Well, she was not just writing stories, she was very much becoming a player. She met Jack Mundy, who's quite famous in the green band scene. She met John Glebe, who was the secretary of the Water and Sewage Union, I think, and various other players. And she was instrumental in getting one after another ban on development in Victoria Street occurring.
The green ban and the resultant delay in the redevelopment are now costing Frank Tiemann $3,000 a day in interest payments alone. Through her connection with the Water and Sewerage Union, Juanita Nielsen now stands as the biggest obstacle to Frank Tiemann's redevelopment dream, and more immediately, his financial security.
He tried to persuade through charm Juanita. Every attempt that he made failed. He began to be disillusioned that he could achieve some sort of resolution by the normal means that he employed.
Juanita starts to receive threatening telephone calls and fears for her safety. Unknown to her at the time, a number of attempts are made to lure her away.
And we said, well, in that light, we agreed that she would keep me fully informed of her movements from that time on, so that should anything occur, I would be immediately alert to it. And we followed that for some weeks.
And in keeping with this policy, Juanita tells him that she has a meeting with Eddie Trigg at the Carousel Club on the morning of July 4, 1975, to discuss advertising in the newspaper Now.
Juanita arrived at the club and walked up the stairs.
Loretta Crawford is the receptionist at the Carousel Club.
She was met by Loretta Crawford, who'd been asked earlier that morning to make sure that she was there on time because of the meeting with Juanita. Loretta had hoped that Juanita would not turn up, but here she was in front of her, and she worried about what was going to unfold that day.
Sorry I'm so late.
Oh, that's all right.
Bit of a hard night, but...
Bit of a bumpy one, was it?
Yeah, something like that.
Would you like to have a coffee?
Yeah, that would be great, thank you.
Hi, Juanita. So to come upstairs?
Eddie Trigg came down from the upstairs VIP room and greeted Juanita and escorted her back up to the bar.
So as I mentioned, a half-page ad will be $130.
Eddie Trigg pays Juanita $130 for a half-page advertisement in Now and is given a receipt for the transaction. This is the last known moment of Juanita Nielsen's life. She had made plans to have dinner with David Farrell later that evening, but she never shows.
I continued to call in the early hours of the morning and on and on. My voice was heard on the message bank that she had. We were extremely concerned. I spoke to other friends, and it was Saturday night I went to the police and reported her as a missing person.
In 1983, 8 years after Juanita Nielsen disappeared, a coronial inquest concludes that she's probably dead, but that it's not possible to say how, when, or where she died. And the jury adds that there is evidence to show that the police inquiries were inhibited by an atmosphere of corruption, real or imagined, that existed at the time.
It was big and public. It was on TV every night. The police were intensely busy, but they were not investigating intensively, as far as I knew, at the carousel, where I believe she never left alive.
It's obvious that the person with the most to gain from Juanita Nielsen's demise is Frank Tiemann. Not only is he losing huge sums of money, but he believes his dream for Victoria Street is vanishing. Increasingly desperate, Frank Tiemann turns to Jim Anderson for help. Anderson is the manager of the Carousel Cabaret and a well-known underworld figure. He is also a police informant and a standover man with a reputation for losing his temper.
The background is important in explaining just the way that Jim Anderson became involved. Juanita had published some fairly strident articles in May 1975, and towards the end of May, on the 26th of May, Frank Tiemann gave Jim Anderson a cheque for $25,000 that was ostensibly to use the money to set his son, his wayward son, Tim Tiemann, up in a club.
Tim Tiemann is a heavy drug user and a close friend of Jim Anderson. Meanwhile, Frank Tiemann approaches the so-called boss of the cross, Abe Saffron, and asks to borrow $25,000 in cash to give to Anderson in place of the cheque.
Abe Saffron told him that he didn't have that sort of money on the premises. So the deal went through. It was recorded in Frank's books, and it remained there as a financial link at a critical time between him and Jim Anderson.
Anderson claims that the cheque is an advance for the purchase of a club in Bondi, but at the inquest, the owner of the business in question testifies that no money is ever received.
Within a matter of a few days of the cheque changing hands, Jim became very interested in Juanita.
The 1994 Federal Joint Parliamentary Committee concludes that Anderson is a prime suspect in the disappearance of Juanita Nielsen. But when interviewed by police in 1977, he tells them that he was in Surfers Paradise.
Jim's alibi was that he was on the Gold Coast and had been there for a few days, and the importance of this alibi was that it got him out of Sydney and away from the scene of Juanita's disappearance.
Many myths are perpetuated about Juanita's disappearance, but what is known for certain is that she keeps her appointment to meet Eddie Trigg on that fateful Friday morning.
My office is just up here.
Trigg works for Jimmy Anderson at the Carousel Club and has been trying to get Juanita to a meeting for a number of weeks.
Sure.
Eddie Trigg was ordered by Jim Anderson one morning, and Jim by this stage was utterly furious. He ordered Eddie Trigg to go down to Juanita's home at 202 Victoria Street. And Eddie went down there after having picked up Shane Martin Simmons.
Both Trigg and Martin Simmons are gun lovers who often go hunting in the Blue Mountains.
All right, fine. It's going to be happy days, Eddie.
The plan is to grab Juanita and stop her from calling out. If she resists, they have rope to tie her up and a pillow slip to place over her head. But the kidnapping is thwarted when David Farrell answers the door.
So I invited Eddie and his associate in, and they said they were interested in buying advertising for the carousel to have businessmen's lunches.
In 1975, Monet King is known as Marilyn, a glamorous blonde transsexual employed at the Carousel Club and in a relationship with Eddie Trigg. He recalls a telephone conversation between Trigg and Juanita the day before the disappearance.
And I just heard Eddie saying, "Oh, it's Eddie Trigg here. I've been trying to contact you with regards to discussing advertising in your newspaper. Can I make an appointment with you tomorrow, please? It's getting rather urgent."
But at that stage, Juanita didn't know that there was anything to be suspicious about. It seemed perfectly legitimate.
Hi, I'm Juanita.
Although a little late, Juanita arrives for the meeting as planned.
Hi, Juanita. So they come upstairs?
Okay.
Shortly afterwards, Monet King also turns up at the Carousel Club looking for Eddie Trigg and is relieved to see his car parked outside. Trigg hadn't been home the night before.
Darling, where's Eddie? He didn't come home last night and I'm worried sick.
Oh, Marilyn, stop panicking, love. He's upstairs in the office.
Yeah? Oh, thanks,
He's having a meeting with the lady, though.
Monet King heads upstairs to the VIP room, but is stopped at the door by Shane Martin Simmons.
An advertising lady, I'm sorry, you can't go in, huh?
He said, "You can't go in there, Marilyn, he's working." I said, "Oh." I could see that he meant business and I'd never get past there.
Just let me know as soon as you
Marilyn, I said no, not today.
Will you tell him that I need to see him right away? Okay, I'm going to be downstairs waiting with Loretta.
I'll let him know.
That bastard Shane won't let me in.
I was just a bit annoyed because he hadn't come home and I wanted to see where he was and, you know, how you get suspicious if your partner doesn't come home.
Right, that's it. I'm over this waiting. I'm going to go check on him and see what's going on.
Oh, Marilyn, he said...
There is still no sign of Trigg or Juanita when Monet returns upstairs 15 minutes later. But this time, Martin Simmons is gone and the door to the VIP room is locked.
You going, girl?
I couldn't get in. The door was locked. I had to find him.
All right, love.
So I rushed down, past Loretta and out the door. Eddie's car had gone. I thought, oh, they must have come down the back door. You know, there's only one other entrance going from the top of the VIP right down to where his car was. It comes steeply down the steps.
It stands to reason that if somebody can leave the VIP room without being seen, they could enter it undetected as well. According to Monet, Martin Simmons is now outside, looking startled and agitated, and peering down the street in all directions. Many hours pass before Eddie Trigg returns to the Carousel Club. What happens next is never told to the investigating police.
Finally went back up and I said, "Eddie, what on earth's going on?" I said, "Look, there's blood on your shirt. Where is she?"
Where is she?
He said, "Oh, she's gone home."
Well, home.
Gone home?
How was it going?
When? I said, "Where on earth have you been all this time?" Then he showed me his fist. It was black and blue. I said, "Eddie, how could she have gone home? You've punched her." He said, "Well, the police ask. Say, I punched you." I said, "Well, I haven't got a black eye, have I?" He said, "Well, you soon will if you don't stop asking questions." And I saw on the pocket of the shirt there was a piece of paper. And I said, "What's this? Do you want this?"
And what is this? Huh?
It's a receipt.
I said, oh, Eddie, I said, it's got blood on it. What is it? He said, oh, I'll need that, that's the receipt. Goodness me, a receipt with blood on it, so he cut that part off. Burnt it, I think, but oh my goodness, that didn't sit too well with me.
Monet, or Marilyn as he was then known, returns to his native New Zealand in the early 1980s and is not called to give evidence at the coronial inquest.
There was something else about Marilyn that kept her apart, certainly in the way that she saw things going on. She was quite religious and had a photo of Jesus on the dressing table of the flat she shared with Eddie. So there were some values there that I think the others didn't have.
For her part, Loretta Crawford claims there is a third man, high on drugs, at the Carousel Club that morning. She says she saw him standing over Juanita's body in the downstairs storeroom, holding a gun. Likewise, there are varying accounts of where Juanita Nielsen is buried, including one that suggests her remains are in concrete under what was an old bar at the top of William Street. But given that her handbag is found dumped alongside the F4 Western Freeway shortly after she disappeared, the Blue Mountains is considered a likely place.
We can get to closure. We can get to know exactly what happened. I'd like to find the body. I'd like to know where the body was, but I don't have that knowledge. Someone does. Someone knows where she's buried or placed.
On their deathbeds in 1989 and 2003 respectively, Frank Tiemann and Jimmy Anderson offer little information about Juanita Nielsen's fate.
Let's go look at them now, I said to Eddie, they're dead. And they didn't say a thing about her. I said, do you want that to happen to you?
Jim was the organiser. It was Jim who pulled the strings in this case. Jim was the one who was providing the muscle. He'd provided the muscle to get rid of Arthur King from the scene, albeit Arthur had survived. In this case, he was providing the muscle to remove Juanita permanently from the scene. He had the power. He was the figure who was feared in the cross.
In the early 1980s, Eddie Trigg and Shane Martin Simmons are both convicted for the earlier conspiracy to abduct Juanita Nielsen. Trigg is sentenced to 3 years jail, while Martin Simmons is given 2 years in prison. But no one is ever arrested in relation to Juanita Nielsen's actual disappearance. And neither Trigg nor Martin Simmons have confirmed or denied Monet King's version of events.
And so I feel for both of them because what a dreadful thing they've done. What a horrendous thing. And yet you can't totally blame them because they were coerced and hounded to do the dirty work of these rich so-called people that want to flourish as far as wealth and worldly goods go.
I think that Eddie is one of these people that is amoral. He doesn't have a conscience. He focuses on himself and what's necessary for him to advance himself. He's capable of doing anything, I think, from that perspective.
This is 202 Victoria Street today. It stands as a monument to Juanita Nielsen and her effort to successfully save many of the beautiful terraces in this neighbourhood. It's also a reminder of her battle against crime and corruption. The tiny house is being considered for heritage listing, but ironically, expressions of interest have also been sought to redevelop the site.
If there was a decision to knock the little house down and all it symbolises for the little person standing up for their rights, it would be very sad indeed. I think Juanita and her memory, and in fact the people of King's Cross and Victoria Street, deserve much more than squelch.